You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 219. Today, we are bringing back a classic rebroadcast of an interview I did with Dr. Mark Sundberg back in early 2020. Dr. Sundberg has been one of my main mentors for 2 decades now. We were both involved with the Pennsylvania Verbal Behavior Project when I started as the lead behavior analyst there in 2003. We did this interview, and in it, I talk about my writing my second book, Turn Autism Around. And back in 2020, I had just gotten the contract and I was in progress with writing. It's been out now for 2 years. Dr. Sundberg's episode is one of the most popular episodes too. He is the creator of the VB-Mapp Assessment. He worked hand in hand with Dr. Jack Michael, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he worked in the 70s and 80s and onward with Dr. Jack Michael to really form the whole movement to get the verbal behavior approach into the hands of ABA practitioners. So I am thrilled to bring this interview back. It's one of my favorites. I hope you love it as much as I do. So I am so thrilled to have one of my favorite mentors here, Dr. Mark Sundberg. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Mark.
Welcome.
I have been trying to get you on for many months, and so this is just a thrill to have you for as long as we can have you with your brilliance. So the way I like to start the podcast is to describe your fall into the autism world, the ABA world, and I know you go way back and have a lot of history, but can you briefly tell us about your work in the 70s and 80s that got you interested?
Sure. Well, I accidentally, I would say, stumbled into a incredible environment at Western Michigan University, which was a fully behavioral psychology department at the time. And it just happened that there were a good collection of behavior analysts that were developing the field actually at that time. In the early 70s, really behavior modification was just coming of age. Behavioral approaches, behavioral methodology was just beginning to become popular. But at Western Michigan University, there was a clinical setting called Kalamazoo Valley Multi-Handicap Center. And that program was directed by Jerry Shook. And almost all students, certainly all graduate students, but all undergraduate students who went through Western Michigan's psychology program were required to do a 10-hour-a-week practicum. And Jerry Shook's program was one of the practicum sites. And that's where I did my practicum. And in the same semester, I went out to work with Jerry Shook and other individuals. I took Jack Michael's class on verbal behavior. So that was 1974. So
wow.
Exact same January I started learning about Mans and Tax, I was starting to work with children for the first time. And that was quite an experience. That semester basically set the course for the rest of my career. I eventually became a full-time staff member at the Multi-Handicap Center. And in that program, we had about 60 students. It was run through the public school system, Kalamazoo Valley Intermediate School District. We had individuals from basically 1.5 years old, all the way up to 25. And so it was a wide range of problems. Many of our students lived in the Kalamazoo State Hospital and came from the hospital. Many of them were on their way to the state hospital, and this was sort of the last step. But again, in the 70s, it was not uncommon to institutionalize Down syndrome kids and other kids with autism or whatever other behavior problems they may have had. So this was a population that most professionals didn't really know what to do with them. They weren't sure what to do with a nonverbal 15-year-old kid that was highly aggressive, other than institutionalize and medicate. The notion that you could teach the child to engage in appropriate behaviors and reduce the negative behaviors was not well developed at that time. At the Multi-Handicap Center, I ended up working there 6 years full time. So all through my graduate, master's, and doctoral program, I worked at the program during the day, and we had the nonstop flow of Western Michigan University students. And these students would come into the program in their junior year. So they had already had a rat lab with Dick Malott. They had had human development class. They had had Jack Michael's verbal behavior class. They had had an abnormal sight class as their 4th class. Their 5th class in the curriculum was called applied behavior analysis. So now they came to the applied area after having those 4 courses, and then they came out to our center. So our entry-level hands-on staff had verbal behavior, had had a rat lab, had had abnormal psych, had had this behavioral history, and we were all set up on a one-on-one intervention. It was a basic, and I'd say one of the earliest ABA-style programs within a public school system. But again, bringing students in at that entry level was incredible. And we really didn't know what we had because we didn't have much to compare it to, but yet we were in this environment where everybody talked behavior analysis. Most everybody had had verbal behavior courses. Most everybody knew the basic principles and concepts. What they didn't know was children. And that's what we taught them. That is, they worked in the rat lab. Now let me show you how to do shaping with a child. Show you how to fade out prompts, because you can't fade out prompts very easily with animals and such. And so there are a lot of differences.
And your dissertation was published in 1980, and that was under Jack Michael was your dissertation chair?
Yes. Jack was my chair, and Brian Iwata was on my committee. Brian and Jack were our research consultants at the Multi-Handicap Center, and they used to come out to the center pretty much every week for our research meetings and such. And in that time period with Jack, at that time, Jack was very interested in verbal behavior, and we had a number of his master's students and doctoral students who did their master's thesis or dissertations in verbal behavior. So the very beginning kind of things that Jack did with us was first kind of teach us how do you establish a manned repertoire, a tact, interverbal. How do you establish and teach these repertoires, and how do you control motivating operations, contrive motivating operations? Then we progressed into a series of research on the distinction between the man and the tact, the distinction between the man and the interverbal, and that collection of studies. My dissertation was basically, I had 6 kids who were pretty much nonverbal. And we taught actually all 6 kids learned sign language. They were all non-vocal, taught them all signs. They all acquired man's, tacts, interverbals. And so the dissertation was basically the application of Skinner's analysis to establishing a verbal repertoire. And that was a lot of fun.
Which, you've been a huge mentor to me. I first came across your work with the ABLES in 1999, 2000. And we had just started Lovaas type ABA with Lucas in 1999 when he was diagnosed the day before he turned 3. So when I transitioned from a Lovaas approach to using the ABLES, and back then it was a very primitive kind of nobody really knew what they were doing kind of program. So, I got my start in the Lovaas approach. And I do think that it's in my book a little bit, the verbal behavior approach, which of course you wrote the foreword for my book, which I'm eternally grateful for. And, there is still a lot of kind of old school traditional ABA discrete trial without a huge bringing in any parts or a big part of Skinner's analysis. And so while Lovaas really contributed to the field immensely, especially with his hallmark paper published in 1987, but you were doing your work in the 70s and 80s, and you were using all of that behavior modification at the time, but bringing in Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So how do you see traditional LOVAS and traditional approaches to ABA versus using a verbal behavior approach?
Sure. Well, what Lovas did for us and all of his colleagues is really kind of lay out the basic teaching procedures for establishing imitation, echoic, tacting, which he called expressive labeling, and receptive skills, and so on. That is the application of basic behavior mod, prompting, fading, shaping, the structure, the teaching arrangement, and so on. And those were all really critical to establishing instructional control, developing skills, and so on. But Lovas, like most everybody in the early 70s, were, when it came to language, were pretty much using the expressive receptive framework of language. That is, when Joubert and Lovas and others were at the University of Washington at the kind of birth of applied behavior analysis in Washington, there wasn't really much known about Manns and Tacks and interverbal. Skinner's book, people didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to apply it. They weren't sure what to make of it. When the book came out, there was no applied field really in the 1950s. People were interested in the experimental analysis more than the applied field. And so none of the concepts really were well developed. What we basically did, and this was at the direction of Jack, was coming from a verbal behavior standpoint, we're looking at various kinds of verbal operants and kind of noticing or identifying that the Mann repertoire, for example, was not a big part of traditional linguistics. It was not a big part of the expressive receptive distinction. It was never a big part of Lovas's earlier work, nor anybody else. People just weren't looking at the Mann relation as separate from other types of language. And basically what Jack had us do was simply incorporate, let's get the Mann, make sure these kids can Mann. So we're adding Manning to imitation and echoic and matching to sample and receptive skills and expressive skills. The interverbal wasn't discussed much in Lovas's early material. There are examples of interverbal behavior, but the whole notion that a single word, a single response can both occur as a Mann, a tact, and an interverbal. The same word, and that the three are separate skills. Just because you can name something doesn't mean you can ask for it or talk about it. And so if I were to say what was the major contribution of verbal behavior, it's adding in the Mann and the interverbal relations as one element of what a verbal behavior approach might consist of. And that was basically what we did, was we added all of those repertoires together. We also had a different teaching strategy. We all use discrete trial training in terms of formal instruction, but we also begin to do more natural environment training. We begin to mix our trials for a variety of reasons and look at trying to make, and a lot of this came from our speech pathology colleagues at the Multi-Handicap Center, was to make it more kid-friendly, more typical, more fun, more enjoyable, more developmentally appropriate. And so trying to have a child with autism sit at a table for 4, 5, 6 hours a week was pretty difficult, but yet that was our school structure. Our kids did. Our kids came in and participated in 15 to 20-minute teaching sessions, and they were basically able to respond for longer periods of time, but we also interspersed that with a lot of natural environment training, a lot of other kinds of activities and such. So our teaching format gradually differed a lot from Lovas in the early 70s, but again, in the early 70s, that was before the 1977 behavior modification book, Lovas's 77 book, and Lovas's 82 book, the Me book. Neither one of those had come out at that time period. So the group of us that were doing that in that time period, all were kind of learning from each other in conferences, individual presentations, and workshops. The differences between the two are now muddled in the sense that they've merged in many ways, and it's harder to really say there's a huge difference depending on how you approach it. For example, if you go on Lovas's website, you'll find in the center of one of his designs, what constitutes the Lovaas model is teach requesting as soon as possible. Well, there's our manned relation. Now, Ivar and I had long and detailed discussions and arguments about incorporating the man 40 years ago, and he never liked verbal behavior and never wanted to do it. But over time, the whole notion of requesting and demanding was more valuable. Along a similar lines, on that same chart on the Lovaas website, you'll find a strong emphasis on natural environment training. Well, many may not recall, but the Kegels were always harping Ivar to break away from the table, do more natural environment. So Bob Kegel, Laura Schreibman, and others, Marjorie Charlap and others, worked extensively on developing the natural environment training model, Hart and Risley, and incidental teaching, and kind of making learning fun and less rigid in its structure. Yet we're still using basic behavior modification type procedures. So that model has shifted and such. And so really what we're looking at is behavior analysis that involves teaching procedures, much of which were developed by Ivar in terms of the basic skills. But instead of using expressive receptive as the framework, we're using the man-tact interverbal listener discrimination framework to make sure all the different operants are established.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I agree that the Skinner's analysis bringing in, I had a behavior analyst once ask me, it was like a cocktail party poster session. And he's like, well, don't you just think some kids are like discrete trial kids and some kids are VB approach kids? And I looked at him, I'm like, no, like, why would adding B.F. Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior never be a good idea? Like, that is always a good idea. And so I am with you. And I do actually want to add something, and get your take on it. But I do think that now the difference between, using kind of my approach from all of this information that I've gathered over the past 2 decades as a registered nurse, as an autism mom, as a mom of a typical son, as a behavior analyst, as an author, is I think what's missing in a lot of ABA programs that aren't utilizing B.F. Skinner's approach enough is lack of attention to multiple control and lack of attention to transfer trials and errorless teaching and kind of blaming the student for lack of progress. Like, I see that as being really critical. And I want to bring up this I just actually did a podcast. It'll be podcast number 51. And it's on the 5 areas where parents and professionals get stuck. And so we've talked about a couple of them already. So the number 1 area is taking kids from non-vocal to vocal, getting them talking, or getting them saying sounds, or getting a co-control. Like that's an area where kids get stuck. The number 2 area is receptive ID. So that's like understanding, touch your body parts, or touch the banana in a field of 3. I've seen young kids stuck with receptive. I've seen 16-year-olds with no receptive language. It's like, how do you get to be 16 years old and no receptive language? And I remember way back with the Verbal Behavior Project, which is where I first met you, where, I was the lead behavior analyst from 2003 to 2010. You were like a consultant for the project. I remember you coming in and we did case studies one afternoon. And so we presented this kid, I think he was about 8 or 10 years of age. He had just transferred into a classroom. And we had videos of him and we showed them to you. And I remember he had like no receptive language to speak of. He had pica, he had all these issues, right? So I had the teacher at the time holding up she was holding up 2 cards and she was saying touch ball. And he was just touching either one. And I mean, you gave us a lot of advice on the whole picture too, but I remember specifically like having this major aha moment. It kind of changed the whole way I was programming for kids. But you said two things. You said, stop having them hold it up. She doesn't even have any hands to prompt him with, which totally makes sense, right? Like, duh. So we started putting a lot more things on the table. And then the second thing that you said, which was, again, just a huge aha, is in order to get receptive ID, you really have to have strong matching and scanning. And the way you build scanning is through matching, not through receptive ID. And so a lot of my programs now in my online courses and the way I teach is to use multiple controls. So on the probe sheet, it might be touch head with an imitative prompt, and then use a transfer trial to try to shape that down and get rid of that prompt. But so just in general, like you have given me really great advice on, do you have anything to add in terms of like your procedures for really getting matching strong in that case, also getting imitation strong for the body parts and commands, and matching strong for the receptive ID, I think is just huge.
Well, maybe let's talk for a minute about multiple control and tie that in and see how that connects to all of this. Multiple control basically involves where two or more antecedents might control a response. So we're all familiar with using an echoic prompt. That is, I hold up a pen and say pen, and now there we would say I've got a vocal SD and a visual SD. I might also have a motivating operation at strength. That is, the child wants the pen to write something. If I had something a little bit more fun, so it may be that those three sources of control get the child to respond, that they can respond under the circumstances of seeing the item, wanting the item, and hearing the word. That may be easy, but yet it allows you to evoke that word. So I got a response now that I can do something with. I can reinforce it. Now my task is to transfer control, as you had mentioned. That is, usually it's the echoic in that example that gives away what the child should say. Say pen, and I know that if I just hold up the pen, I don't get anything, even though they might want it and try and grab it. It's the echoic that is the primary source of control, but yet these are secondary sources. My task is to make this the primary SD. So that means I've got to transfer control from echoic to the tact, into the object. So that whole concept of transfer stimulus control is really the core of what we do hands-on with kids. We're giving them lots of prompts so they're successful, but the key is to fade out the prompt. And as that applied to the listener discrimination procedure, as you had suggested, in a listener task, when I say touch pen, as you had mentioned, what the individual needs to do is scan the array and then emit some kind of response indicating the pen. But the tricky part is that the source of control is a spoken word, pen or shoe or car. And verbal stimulus control is often very difficult to acquire over kids, and that over kids' verbal behavior. And that is obvious in, for example, the interverbal relation. It's hard to get kids to respond to tell me a big animal that likes to swim. There's a lot of parts to words, and it's hard for kids often to learn to take those words and have some correspondence with the physical environment. That is, what you say goes along with what I'm looking at or what I'm seeing. So the procedure you described was simply establishing a skill. If we look at matching to sample, and if I show you a pen, and I want you to match one of these, a lot of kids can easily do that. That's often not very hard to do, is establish that under the control of this pen, I can now match it to this pen. That is, I can scan an array and I can select. Well, that's the exact behavior that we're after in a listener discrimination. That is, touch pen, the child touches pen. The only difference is I got a second stimulus present. There's our multiple control. So now I say pen when I'm showing the pen. And in a sense, all the child's still doing is matching the sample. They're just identifying in a matching framework. My task is to get rid of this pen and transfer stimulus control to touch pen. And there are a variety of procedural ways to do that. We begin to call that the blank card procedure, because we'd have, for example, if this had a picture of a pen on it, I would use that as a prompt, where I'd say find pen, and the child would match the sample. Then we'd gradually put our hand over it or do it quickly. Find pen, and pretty soon transfer control from the picture to the word. And that's all the procedure was if you're able to do it with a visual stimulus, now I got to teach you to do it with a verbal stimulus. And turns out that it wasn't so hard to do. So that was always fun then, to see kids now get it correctly, even though they're looking at this blank card. And what we ended up figuring out was the blank card was almost a prompt to scan the array. When they saw the blank card, they looked for stuff. And then eventually we faded out the blank card. So it's those little procedures, but it's that kind of detail, I think, that gets us through barriers that kids struggle with often for years.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's one of the, I think a lot of well-meaning professionals who are running ABA programs, whether you want to call it VB or not, or whatever you were going to call it, if you're missing the analysis of multiple control and transfer procedures, I think that's a lot of the crux of the issues. I know Rick Cabina and I published in 2005 a study, which we can link in the show notes here. I can't remember the name, using transfer procedures to teach tax to a child with autism. It was Lucas was in the study, and he helped me. Rick Cabina was my mentor, and I did a podcast episode with Rick. I think we talked about that study more in depth, but up until that point, like your teaching language book really recommended a lot of echoic to tact trials. But for Lucas, because I think of his strong Lovas ABA background, where receptive was just like gold, right? Was just taught. His receptive on his ABLEs at the time, because there was no VB-Mapp at that point, his receptive column was a lot higher than his tacts. And what I found with his particular profile is if I gave it to him in a receptive to tact format, it was almost like multiple choice. And then, based on that study, there were a lot more studies that were done after that. And so I'm constantly, within my procedures, within my online, I'm constantly like multiple control, blasting the matching, blasting the imitation, and blasting the multiple control. So you're instead of match, you're saying pen, as they're matching, and you're transferring it right away. And we're just having a ton of success. So thank you for that explanation, and thank you for all of what you've taught me over the years. I feel like when I'm in your presence, you like have so much knowledge. So it's just awesome.
Thank you. And you've been great to take the content and teach others how to use it, which is really critical.
Yeah.
Add another piece to the multiple control, if I can.
Yep.
Multiple control is our friend, and so we need it in the early stages to evoke behavior, and then, as you had said, we've got to get rid of those other sources of control. So it sets us up for that nice teaching procedure. But as language becomes more complex, multiple control is mandatory in many verbal relations, and you don't want to get rid of those other sources of control. In fact, you can't. And let me give you the example of if I were to say something like, what shape is this? What color is this? If I say, what shape? The word shape is a verbal stimulus. The actual shape of the item is a nonverbal stimulus. In order to respond correctly, both sources of control have to be operative. That is, I have to hear the word shape and respond to the verbal stimulus, because that word changes this cup. It establishes this as the SD rather than the color. If I say what color, this is now an S delta, and the color is now an SD. That effect, where both verbal and nonverbal stimuli interact, is an example of multiple control. And as you get into more complex language involving nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, conversations, and so on, those multiple sources of control are going to be required in order to respond correctly. And that's where things get pretty complicated at that level.
Things get complicated very early on, and I do think that that's some of the issues. It is very complex, and I see, different ABA providers. Well, we do teach manding, we do teach interverbals, but it's like this whole analysis of the multiple control and transfer trials and making sure kids are making progress and not just keep sticking with the same programs with lack of progress, I think is a detriment to our kids. So, all right. So you have some exciting work you're currently doing on generative learning. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. In typical language development, some amazing things happen between about 2 and 3 years of life. That is, typically developing kids' language generally explodes during that time frame. So a child might go from 100-word speaking vocabulary at 2 to 1,000-word speaking vocabulary at 3, acquires skills in one trial, reinforcement's not required, behaviors acquired without adults interacting with a child. Part of our issue is that so many kids with autism never make that leap. So we have profile after profile, decades and decades, where kids would get stuck in kind of mid-level 2 range on the VB-Mapp. That is, they would acquire man's tax, interverbals, echoics, imitative skills, and so on. But they had a rough time breaking through this generative ceiling where language takes care of themselves. Language really, in a sense, kids learn language on their own. In many ways. And what we're after is, how does that happen? And when it doesn't happen, what kind of things need to be done? And so if we look at what are we talking about when we say generative learning? And we're talking about there are particular repertoires that once they're acquired, they accelerate or enable other repertoires. That is, prior learning affects later learning. If you have a certain set of skills, you now can do some more advanced kind of things, often without reinforcement, without direct training. Take reading, for example. Once a child has acquired a reading repertoire, once they have that skill, they can acquire new information through reading. That is, they can learn stories, they can learn recipes, any kind of thing that's appropriate for their level, follow instructions and so on that are written. If that repertoire is established, then learning can occur, again, without any further adult training. Once I can read, I'm on my own. At a simpler, earlier level, if a child, and this is not necessarily generative, but it kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Once a child learns to crawl, for example, and it may take thousands of learning trials to get to the point of being able to crawl, once they can crawl, that repertoire opens the door to all kinds of new contingencies. And any parent knows once their child moves off that blanket, the world has changed, because now there's different things in that other room. I can now crawl to other reinforcers, pick up items and grab things. Those new contingencies shape behavior on their own. That is, the parent no longer needs to provide every SD, every reinforcement, every trial. Now, if you think again of a lot of our early work with children with autism, we're often teaching every single response in the child's repertoire early on. We're establishing those. We have history, data collection, and so on. We need to get the child to the point to where they begin to learn on their own. And so that as an overall goal is pretty critical. Don Baer's concept of behavioral cusps provides us with a direction in this area, and it also kind of organizes the subject matter a little bit. And the way he talks about a behavioral cusp is a behavior change that brings the child into contact with new contingencies, new reinforcers, new stimuli. And those contingencies in turn shape and develop new behaviors. And that's examples of reading, crawling. Once a child has learned to pincer grasp, now they can pick up things they couldn't do before. and that picking up things now shapes new behavior. So there's kind of, again, arrangements where an adult is not required anymore. Once I can walk, I now have access to new things that are going to shape behavior. Once you have an imitative repertoire, which is usually the hallmark of some of the generative learning stuff, once you have a generative imitative repertoire, I can now acquire new behavior with no formal training. I can do something correct on the first trial with no reinforcement. And that's sort of been the golden egg in many respects, where I look at it and say that that's where we want to head for children with autism, is to where new behaviors are acquired. But here's the trick, is that it only works if you have a certain set of prerequisite repertoires. That is, you have to have an echoic repertoire, an imitative repertoire, a tact repertoire, and so on, before you can move into an advanced stage. On the VB-Mapp, I've identified about 30 different generative learning repertoires. And those generative learning repertoires are often very difficult to achieve. And yet they're extremely powerful. I'll give you some examples of some level 1 things so you can kind of see how these fit in.
So are you, hold on 1 second. So you're saying all the milestones within the VB-Mapp you would consider generative learning repertoires that are important. Is that what you're saying?
No, not all. No,
okay.
Only about 30.
30. Okay. Okay.
30. And I can I'll eventually attach a PowerPoint maybe where people can look at that. And that's some of the in fact, that the Penn State conference, National Autism Conference, has got a video archive of that where I lay out those 30 or 32 and talk about them.
Okay, we can definitely attach that then.
Okay, so at level 1, if we look at what skill, if we look at the definition that we're talking about is using Rosales Ruiz and Baer's definition of a behavioral cusp, where one set of skills enables or accelerates another set of skills, and it brings an individual into new contingencies with no reinforcement. That's kind of what we're operating at. On the VB-Mapp, there's 3 milestones that meet that criteria. One is manding. So if we look at our early intervention, we've known for a long time, certainly, that manding is really important. But it's also important because it's generative. So man milestone 5 in level 1 says the child can man for 10 items. Well, once that manned repertoire is at that level, once it's established, it takes off on its own in many ways. That is, if I can man, I can now get access to something new that will shape new behavior. Also, the manned repertoire, as we know, is often one of the best ways to eliminate negative behavior and behavior problems. The work on functional communication training has empirically demonstrated that. The man can replace problem behaviors. Well, there's a huge behavioral cusp in the sense that if you can eliminate or reduce a child's behavior problems simply through talking, through manding, that opens the door to new contingencies and new opportunities. And so that's a big one that we've always focused on that. Another one in the level 1 is babbling, automatic reinforcement. When speech sounds are reinforcing, when a child likes to hear their own voice, when they respond because speech sounds are conditioned reinforcers, that's also another powerful behavioral cusp that changes the way a child can learn. The third one in level 1 is in the social milestones. Milestone 5 is where a child will, in an unprompted manner, follow a peer or respond to a peer's SDs. And the significance of that is a peer has stimulus control over a child's behavior. And we look again at many children with autism, and that's one of our biggest issues, is that peers don't demonstrate stimulus control. A child doesn't attend to or emit behavior controlled by another child's behavior. If we can get that, and we should get that at level 1, that is, an 18-month-old child begins to imitate another child just in terms of say, following them around. So those kind of skills become more significant than the other 42 skills. Now, those other 42 skills are certainly important, But what we're after is those particular skills. Now, when you get into level 2, all those generative repertoires are all along the top of number 10, the top of the second level. All the number 10 milestones are all generative milestones. Those are all generally skills that once they're acquired are going to allow the child to learn new skills. For example, milestones in the tact repertoire, in the listener repertoire. If we look at both milestones 9 and 10 on the tact and the listener, milestones 9 are once a child can tact noun-verb combinations and receptively respond to noun-verb combinations, that's indicative of what we'd often talk about as recombinative generalization. That is, I can teach a set of verbs and I can throw in any noun, and you now can give me a noun-verb response on the very first trial. Or I can do the opposite. I can teach the noun and put it into a new verb. Well, that's Howard Goldstein's work, and that's one of the many, many different types of generative learning. So that milestone, again, is one that it's a little harder to achieve for a child than other milestones. But once you got it, if I can get the child to the point to where they can put in a new noun on any verb, boom, they're off with that repertoire. I'll pause there to see if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. And I think part of the problem I see parents and professionals struggling with is, the overuse of teaching carrier phrases, the overuse of teaching rote responding, and not having milestones in the level 1 area, milestones in level 2 up to 9 fixed. So it's like people are building a base on building on top of a very unstable base and making weird language. And so, like, as you're talking, I'm like, that's why my emphasis is so much on getting to the kids when they're first showing signs of autism, when they're first diagnosed, and trying not to mess up their language or teach too high, which is always happening, and trying to let things use multiple control, let kids build language, don't overteach things like intraverbals, don't go step by step. And so this leads, actually, let's go to the next question, which I think really is an important one. I've heard even really good behavior analysts that are friends of mine saying that the VB-Mapp isn't developmentally sequenced, which I know it is. I know your work in making it developmentally sequenced, and kind of like, I know the ABLES was not as developmentally sequenced as either of us would have liked, or the VB-Mapp isn't good for kids over 5 because it's only good for, a language age of up to 4 or 5. And it's like, this important work, whether or not we're actually filling out the VB-Mapp for a teenager, this is important work to show that you can't just skip ahead and get a kid conversational. It's just not going to be like waving your magic wand. And some of the things that I did over the years, kind of didn't help Lucas get unstuck. And so now I want to help people prevent that. And so I guess maybe just respond to your work. And I know, because I helped field test the VB-Mapp back in 2006, I know the developmental checklist and the sequencing and the rigor that was involved with creating the VB-Mapp. So can you just tell us really briefly about that, and whether there's research based on it and all that?
Sure. Yeah, the whole developmental aspect, like you're talking about, the interverbal in general, is that we ran the VB-Mapp on a number of typically developing kids, and basically looking for, on average, what's a typically developing 18-month-old child talk about? What can they do? What can't they do? Using developmental charts, kids. I was teaching a child development class. We had child development labs. We had groups of 10-year-old or 10 typically developing 1 and 2 and 3-year-olds. And so just to try and find out, what are they talking about? What can they do adjectives, nouns, a verb, combination? No, they can't. Do they do contractions? No, they don't. I mean, so you're beginning to sort out what repertoires do we have naturally occurring and what ones do not occur. The interverbal arrangement that we had was basically that 80 questionnaire, 80 types of interverbals that we gave to a range of kids, and found that there was a clear pattern in the types of questions that a 2-year-old could answer versus a 3-year-old versus a 4-year-old. Once you got up to questions that ask you things like what can fly in the water and walks on land, or what do you eat that's hot? Once your question had 2 or 3 parts to it, typically developing kids couldn't answer that. So we sequence things in that kind of manner. But the outcome of this is pretty critical. Or if we look at why would you do that? You brought up the interverbal relation again. And if we look at how is it that you get to generative interverbal behavior? How do you get to where you say new things under new subject matter, where people ask you a question, you say something different. It's not rote. It's a novel response. It's combined. And it goes back to, again, suggesting that that repertoire is composed of earlier skills. You have to have some prior learning. You already have to know some things before you can talk about them. And that's where one of the things that we often focused is that in order to talk about things in their absence, that is, tell me some animals that fly. In order to answer that, you have to be able to talk about them in their presence. At least for our children with autism, that is, if I'm not sure that the child needs to be able to, in that example, tact flying. They need to be able to, as a listener, know what flying consists of. They need to be able to tact categories of birds and airplanes and other things that can fly. They need to be able to do them as a listener, in listener responding by feature, function, and class. That is, touch something that flies, touch something that floats, touch something that swims, and so on. So if you can't accurately talk about them, if you don't have the foundational skills, the probability of getting a rote interverbal is very high. You can still learn that interverbal repertoire, what flies in the air, and a kid will say airplane. But yet, if they don't understand fly as a verb, you got a rote response. In our 2011 study, which laid out the 80-item interverbal assessment, we were seeing pieces of that. And again, we proposed in that paper that in order to get emerging interverbal behavior, you had to have 4 repertoires. Those 4 repertoires were, you had to have the tact and listener skills of the nouns and verbs, and you had to have the listener skills and tacts of the categories of animals, let's say, and vehicles, and that if you can identify the categories, that is, of animals and flying and so on, you can then put all those repertoires together. Wayne Fisher and his colleagues just recently published a paper in JABA, 2019 January issue, where they tested that. And they tested, again, the interverbal relations, and they looked at those 4 skills. They taught the tact of the item, the listener of the item, the tact of the category, the listener of the category. And basically what their results showed was that once all 4 repertoires were established, on the very first trial, they got immediate, emergent, novel interverbal behavior. That is, the kids were now able to correctly respond to the questions once they had all 4. If they only had 3 of these skills, they didn't respond correctly. It wasn't until all 4 prerequisite elements of the verbal repertoire were established that we were now able to get emerging interverbal behavior. There's our generative repertoire. That's exactly what we're talking about. So then we go back and we say to teachers and families, establish these foundational repertoires in a solid manner. Make sure that they're truly a generalized repertoire of categorical tacting. And when you have that, your probability of getting to emerging relations is much higher.
Yeah. And I feel like your work with the interverbal subtest, which we can link in the show notes, is really super important. I have within my online verbal behavior bundle, I have 25 bonus videos. And one of the bonus videos is teaching interverbal skills. And, within all of my courses and bonus videos are me working with kids, thousands of videos of me demonstrating. But, I see this a lot too, where second graders having problem behaviors, they are supposedly conversational or at least talking, and then they're not doing well, they're going to get kicked out of general education or something. And I suggest do the group 7 and 8 of the interverbal subtest, because labeling a kid as just a problem behavior, like 9 times out of 10 in my experience, there's a language comprehension intraverbal issue, and it's a language problem instead of a behavioral problem or an academic problem. And so I really encourage people to do that assessment, the interverbal subtest, even if they're not going to use the whole VB-Mapp, just to see if you need to do a VB-Mapp. Mm-hmm. Because I think there is a lot of confusion of just like passing kids through and they're fine, and really they're not fine. And there's a lot of holes, and I see a lot of holes with kids too, with autism, unfortunately. Okay, so let's switch gears a teeny bit, because I want to wrap up as in the next couple of minutes. But before we do that, there are some questions that I'm getting a lot on, is my child's going to go to kindergarten next year, or should my child be going to regular education school or autism ABA school, or should I do home ABA? Should I do school ABA? And you've done a lot of work with the transition assessment. So the VB-Mapp, for those of you that aren't familiar, is the milestones, the barriers, and the transition assessment. All 3 parts are really important, especially for kids who are going to potentially go to group instruction or learning. So can we talk about self-care and group learning and the transition assessment and why you think it's so important?
Sure. The transition assessment was basically a result of spending a pretty fair amount of time in transitional IEPs and IEPs where the child received their services is an issue, what kind of educational setting. And so basically I ended up coming up with about 18 different skill sets that simply gave parents and teachers some data to base the decisions on. That is, for those of you who spent time in those kind of meetings, often children were placed in settings that were totally inappropriate. That is, we'd have kids that would be level 1 of the VB-Mapp and placed in a first grade classroom for particular reasons. And I would look at that and say, well, it's a highly restrictive environment. This child can't access the curriculum of a first grade classroom. There's some social things and maybe other reasons to do that. The other direction would occur too, where we would have situations where a child would be in level 3 of the VB-Mapp, have some very extensive verbal skills, but the child would be placed in a very intensive discrete trial ABA type program. And we're looking at both arrangements and saying, well, both of those are the most restrictive setting. That if you've got a child that's level 3 on the VB-Mapp, you don't need one-on-one intensive 30-hour a week behavioral intervention. That may not be the most or the least restrictive. So these 18 items basically looked at the individual child simply to give the parents and the teachers some data, some information to base their decisions on what educational setting, what teaching arrangement would produce the best type of learning on the child's part. So if you look at, that's what we're interested in, is what environment does the child learn best in? And there are often all kinds of other reasons to place a child here or there, but what we want to know is, where does the child get the most gain out of? And so there's a collection of things to look at. And for example, one of them was just what level is the child in the VB-Mapp. So if you start out with a level 1 child versus a level 3 child, a level 1 child, a child scoring at the level 1 level, still needs intensive behavioral intervention. They still need staff that can prompt, fade, shape, intensive data collection, highly specialized staff. And those staff typically aren't available in a regular ed classroom or a less restrictive setting. So if you're going to put a child in that environment, it's clearly going to affect their learning. They will not learn as well if they're in a setting that doesn't use a task analysis and so on. The child at level 3, on the other hand, is less susceptible to kind of sloppy behavior mod. That is, you don't have to take data on every trial. You don't have to reinforce it. You got a kid that can handle, is on a good extinction schedule, can raise his hand 15 times before he gets called on, but hang in there. Whereas a level 1 child or a level 2 child may not. So as you look at that level, it tells you something. If you look at other skills, like for example, one of the 18 is the reinforcement schedule. If you've got a child that has to be reinforced on every trial, every 5 trials, every 10 trials, that's not going to happen in a less restrictive setting. You're not going to get that rich schedules of reinforcement. There's not going to be any edibles or tangibles. There won't be those kind of things that we see in an ABA type classroom versus a first grade classroom.
Or just, I see this a lot too, is, oh, well, he'll have a one-to-one. They agreed to a one-to-one. This is an untrained one-to-one who is not going to know what behaviors to reinforce, whether it's a level, 1 or 2 child. That worries me too, is just because the funding is such that everybody goes to regular ed and you can fight for a one-to-one. If you don't have a behavior analyst who can not just train, but guide and provide ongoing consultation, that's a really not a great situation.
No, and for some kids it may work fine and other arrangements and such, but if we look again at the teaching format and the level of the child to access the curriculum, to access what's being taught. Now, if the child has all those prerequisites, that is, for example, if we're doing interverbal work in a classroom, if I have those 4 repertoires already, maybe I can figure out what's being talked about. But if I don't have those 4 repertoires, I don't have a clue as to what the teacher's talking about. Now, I have a one-to-one, but the one-to-one person can't help me in that setting with what I need to be able to access the interverbal content.
And what I found for kids that are at level 3, they still have some holes and they're in first grade, say, they might be able to be included without one-to-one support, but they are still in need, especially if they're first grade. Then they're, functioning at a 4-year-old level pretty much. In my experience, they still need pull out language for learning or language for thinking. They still need language work. And so I think that's another mistake I see is people go to kindergarten or first grade or whatever. And it's like, they're level 3, but who's going to catch up their language? And if you start just doing academics and the language isn't there, they'll fall apart.
That's right. And if we go back to the generative learning content, one of the differences is your first grader is loaded with generative repertoires. You only need to tell them things once, that they can take what they know in A and it's not generalized. They can now emerge new relations in B and C and D and E. And all kinds of things are happening with that first grader that are not happening with the 4-year-old or the 3-year-old. And especially then add that child with autism who may be 7 or 8, but is scoring at the verbal repertoire of 3 or 4. If they don't have those generative repertoires, they're not going to have a clue. They're not going to be able to learn in the same manner as the first graders. First graders are going to be beyond them in the first week, the second week. They're already way beyond. And the notion that now the kid's going to somehow catch up with first graders without any of those prerequisite repertoires, you can't. And that's where part of the transition assessment is saying, let's look at the repertoires the child has and now see if they have the prerequisite repertoires to benefit from this environment. If it's only minimal, there's all kinds of arrangements that we would do. You just go in for math. If you excel in math, you just go in for reading. avoid circle time at all costs, which is like everybody wants to do that for the first integration. And that's like the hardest thing in the world for a lot of our kids.
Or calendar time, a calendar time with level 1 learners is like, what are we doing here?
Waste of time.
It's a waste of time. And so, it's just, okay. So as we wrap up here, so what can we do? I mean, my online courses cover all of this. Like I have an intermediate learner course that is very robust. It covers language for learning. It covers, reading, math, writing, self-care, showering, like all of the stuff, plus all the language, how do you form 2-word, pivotal phrases, and how do you prevent all this scripting and stimming and all this stuff. But how do we take the field and help our children and clients, reach their fullest potential when we have all of this? I mean, this is you're trying to, really make it accessible for both parents and professionals to listen to this, but it's like, how do we move forward?
Well, I'm going to go all the way back to something you and I were talking about earlier and saying your work and your book is the kind of content that will get people started. I mean, your upcoming book, I don't know if you've announced that yet, but.
All right. I didn't announce it yet, but I will announce it right now. I just got a book deal to publish another book in April of 2021. And I was telling Mark about it before we hit record, but I'm super excited about it. It is for parents, grandparents, early intervention professionals, but anybody that wants to help kids showing signs of autism or newly diagnosed to take action, to not wait in line for a diagnosis or wait in line for treatment, to know what treatment you need, and to really empower parents to become the captain of the ship, to really help their kids change the whole trajectory of their lives. I'm super excited. So thanks for making that little preview of the announcement. So we'll hide it right here towards the end of Dr. Sundberg's great podcast interview. So yeah, so like the work of my book and my toddler course and my, and for older kids who are stuck too, my verbal behavior bundle and the bonuses, but that's just one way. I mean, other ways, like how can we really move the field forward?
Well, education of the special ed teachers and speech language pathologists and parents has been kind of slow but steady. As we've seen gradual change, and I think what we've lacked certainly in the 70s and the 80s was buy-in from the educational institutions. That is, the kind of things that need to be done require a lot of people, a lot of professionals. That is, the people that are working with a child have to have a set of skills that they're not going to get in special ed classes. They're not going to get without behavioral education of one type or another. The development of the BCBA, I think, has been an important change in our field. Now that we have at least that professional level established with RBTs as well, increasingly school districts have been feeling pressure. Insurance companies have played a role in establishing the BCBA. We didn't have that 10 years ago, really. We didn't have it certainly in the 70s or 80s or 90s. So there weren't a lot of trained people out there. So we're getting more and more trained people. Parents have certainly been the driving force behind this change that we've seen in the last probably 20 years or so. Again, knowing that this all works, but it requires a special set of skills. And that's the hard part. I think that big change won't occur until behavior analysis is brought into special education curriculum. And that's a big request. I think we've seen it happen in speech pathology, that we've seen a huge blending of the fields of behavior analysis and speech pathology, in part because we do the same and we're interested in the same things. I felt, again, 15, 20 years ago, when we started getting support from speech pathologists, it legitimized much of what we were doing, in the sense that we could say the child needs to request, they need to get out, they need language, it needs to be 24/7, it can't be 15 minutes twice a week, it has to be intensive. And then to have the speech pathologist community come in and say, yes, we can't do this by ourselves, we need the parents, the teachers, we need everybody on board to do this. Change is gradual, but I got to say, back in the 70s, we thought this would all be figured out by 1980. By 81, everybody would be behavioral, and all school districts would jump on board because it works. And the fact that we're 35, 40 years later and we're kind of saying the same thing may sound discouraging, but yet I look at the progression in my professional lifetime, and it's been massive. The change between just the 90s and now. The 80s and the 90s are much, I'd say it's much more parent friendly, professional friendly, and a much better environment now to make progress. There's certainly more understanding of both autism, children, behavior analysis, and that makes it all, I think, positive in that sense. Now, what we need to do is get the content out there more, and that's where what you're doing is very valuable. The research is very valuable, the how-tos, being able to go to some site, some access point, and be able to get information, I think is really important.
Yeah, I have people, parents and professionals from over 65 countries who have purchased one or more of my courses. And I have members, some of them have been with me since 2015 when I started online. I provide continuing education for behavior analysts. So it is exciting, and I owe a lot to you to have mentored me and to have taught me so much. And it's been a real privilege to get to know you over the past 15 years or so. And I agree. I think we're right at a cusp where this is getting in the hands of parents and professionals and grandparents and early intervention professionals, and they're seeing it works, and they're seeing that the change, whatever change they make, works, and that's super exciting and motivating. And so it's gonna build momentum. So I'm really excited. So part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. Do you have any tips for in that realm?
Well, I think there are two separate issues, parents and professionals. And as a professional, we don't come anywhere near the degree of stress that a parent has. That is, we get to go home. We're done at the end of the day. The parent is 24/7, and the issues are so very different. And I think that if we go back to the point about your early intervention and the point about the material you're doing and others are doing in that area, I think one of the best reducers of stress is to have the right answers, to know what to do. That is, a behavior problem can be incredibly stressful in the store and in public or any situation, and it results in embarrassment, and it results in avoidance, emotional issues, highly complicated for a parent to know what to do and to deal with it. If you've got the right tools, if you know the variables that evoke a tantrum, or you know how to deal with the tantrum when it happens, those are the tools that are going to reduce your stress, that you're able to eliminate aversives, you're able to avoid aversives. In addition, having those same tools that allow you to teach the adaptive skills or teach the language and academic skills, and to see that happen. And it goes back to the early intervention importance. If you bring a parent on board early to teach them about how behavior is acquired, what do you reinforce, how much, ignoring a behavior is okay, and here's when you do it. I mean, once you've got those basic behavioral concepts, if you can empower a parent with those concepts at 1.5 and 2, they're going to avoid a lot of the problems they're going to get at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 typical developmental problems. And so you get them going at the terrible 2s to say, you're going to get a tantrum. Here's what a tantrum's about. Here's how you deal with that. That that repertoire, I think, is probably one of the most powerful skill sets you can impart to a parent early on, because then they now know what's going on with their child, and then they go into the school districts at 3 or whenever services are going to be available, and they know what's good and bad. They know what works and what doesn't work, and they know if you have my child sit there and draw for an hour, he's going to be beating somebody up. You got to have active engagement. He's got to be, he's acquiring a word a day, and at home he should be acquiring at least a word a day in school, and so I think again, knowledge is powerful, and if you can impart the correct knowledge to parents, I think it will avoid problems down the road.
Yes, totally agree. So how can people follow your work? I know you have exciting things coming up in the next months and years ahead.
We just launched a new website. Actually, we launched 2 new websites. MarkSundberg.com has got its first major overhaul in 12 years since I originally put it out there. So there's new pictures, maybe with a beard, I'm not sure. But in that website, what I've provided is there's one link to all my available publications. So there's about 50 papers that people can download. They can download the interverbal assessment and that kind of content. There's also about 35 or so PowerPoints across a variety of topics. And I tried to get a PowerPoint on each one of the major topics, like man training, tact training, interverbal, automatic reinforcement, multiple control, the autoclitic. So if people want the PowerPoint content, and again, it depends, you only get so much out of PowerPoint, but yet those are all there. And then I've linked them to those that are, there's a written paper that corresponds to that particular PowerPoint. They're not all written up, but many of them are, so that you can get the written content as well as the PowerPoint. So that's probably the best access to my written and spoken work that's out there. And there's a few other fun historical things. I have a tribute to Jack Michael on the website, which has some photos and links to Jack Michael's work and some of his contributions. There's links to other resources like your book, your material. Awesome. Other professionals work on there. There's a lot of free downloads of worksheets, picture sheets, and so on. And
you've been,
I want to provide.
Thank you from professionals and parents that are listening. I want to thank you for being so generous with your knowledge, with your information, with your time. You have really, changed. I know you've changed my life, you've changed Lucas's lives, and I know you've changed everyone's life that are in my courses and everything. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. All right, so thanks again for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with everyone and get the more eyes and ears we can get on the podcast, the better we can spread the word. So share it. Give me a 5-star rating and review for the podcast, and that'll help me spread the word even more. Let me know if there's another episode that you'd like me to do, or I'm sure I would love to have Dr. Sundberg on again. So I'm sure we could go on literally for, I'm sure, days and days and keep interviewing you, but I want to respect your time and respect the listeners' time. But thank you so much. It's been a great interview.
Thank you, Mary, for doing this.
If you enjoyed that episode, I would love it if you would go give a Apple or Spotify review, wherever you're listening. I would love a review and rating. Also exciting that the next 2 weeks, we're going to continue our little series on featuring speakers about the VB-Mapp and verbal behavior. Next week, we will have Liz and Steve Marr on the show. And the following week, we're going to have Dr. Barbara Esch, who created the echoic assessment part of the VB-Mapp. So hope you tune in then. If you're not subscribed to the Turn Autism Around podcast, you may want to do that now so you don't miss an episode. See you next time.